Hello, everyone, and welcome to the inaugural podcast of Lashed and the Mast. We will begin with the philosophy portion, looking at some basic metaphysics. Then we will move on to the political section, looking at the first part of the first book of Plato's Republic, and then on to the economic section, where I will be critiquing some of the economics' um, presuppositions about how humans behave. Um, so yeah, without further ado, let's jump into the philosophy portion. Um, this philosophical portion of the podcast will examine the origin of metaphysics through the lens of three schools of thought concerning being from ancient Greece, um, and we'll end by explaining the first of the 24 Thomistic theses. Just as a PSA, please take time to understand the arguments presented before critiquing them. As philosophers, we really shouldn't be setting up straw men and then knocking them down. It's really important to really make an effort to understand the ideas and terms if you want to seriously engage with it, rather than taking a cursory glance and writing them all off as trite. Richard Dawkins. uh, Excuse me. Anyway, so turning to the historical origins of metaphysics, I am now going to shamelessly plagiarize Joseph Owens's An Elementary Christian Metaphysics and Ed Feser's Aristotle's Revenge before also plagiarizing Disputed Questions' defense of the first Thomistic thesis. It's only plagiarism if you get caught, am I right? The first thing to consider is the origin and meaning of the term metaphysics. According to Owens, metaphysics is derived from the Greek ta meta ta physica, which means what comes after the physical, and was used to refer to a set of works by Aristotle, a famous philosopher who lived in 4th century BC in ancient Greece, and yeah, I did mean to say BC and not BCE, which he himself referred to as primary philosophy, theology, or simply wisdom. From this definition, then, we can see that Aristotle and his followers saw metaphysics as sort of a bedrock for the other sciences, with the term after meaning what goes beyond the physical. In this way, metaphysics was seen by the peripatetics, students of the aforementioned Aristotle, to be the study of the supersensible, meaning what goes beyond the sensible. A more modern definition of metaphysics is that metaphysics is the study of being as being. That is, it is the study of a thing from the viewpoint of its being. Now, these definitions might seem a little confusing, and they are, but here's an example to illustrate. Imagine you're a food critic who has just emerged from the drive-thru of Taco Bell, not a sponsor, and you have an order of tacos in front of you that you need to judge. How would you go about judging the taco? One way would simply be to judge the taco as a whole, by eating the whole taco all at once. Being the good food critic that you are, however, you will want to judge the ingredients as well, perhaps by taking the meat out and inspecting it or some of the lettuce, etc., etc., etc. In this way, you are not judging the whole taco at once, but rather judging a part of it as separated from, abstracted from is the technical term, the rest of the taco. Now, this is precisely what looking at a thing from the viewpoint of its being means. Metaphysics isolates being from the thing it is studying and examines it without reference to anything else that the thing has, such as its chemical makeup or extension into space. This is what is meant when we say that metaphysics is the study of being as being, meaning we abstract away from the chemical makeup of the thing, its extension into space, and just look at the slice of it that is being. Yeah, so rather than isolating meat from a taco as you would as a food critic, or isolating the mathematically quantifiable aspects of a thing as physics would, a metaphysician abstracts everything from the thing being studied except its being or existence. Another way to say this is with a really fancy word, qua, as in metaphysics is the study of being qua being. Once again, the definition of metaphysics is the study of the supersensible, meaning what goes beyond meta the sensible, or alternatively, the study of being qua or as being. Um, The next thing to consider is the way that metaphysics originated. We started with Aristotle, we mentioned him earlier in the podcast, but the first metaphysician was actually Parmenides of Elea in the 5th century BC. Um, he argued that change was impossible, since for anything to change would require something already existing to give way to something that until now was not existent. And since something can't come from nothing, that means change must be impossible. Parmenides' student Zeno reinforced Parmenides' idiosyncratic position, which is referred to as static monism, with some famous paradoxes. In one paradox, known as the dichotomy paradox, a runner is attempting to move from point A to point B. However, traveling the distance to B would require traveling half the distance to B, and this in turn requires you to traverse half the distance to B, and so on ad infinitum. Due to this regress, therefore, travel to B must be impossible as well as change in general. On the complete opposite side of things, and also around the same time as Parmenides, interestingly enough, Heraclitus held that there was no such thing as being, but only becoming, i.e., permanence never arises since everything is always changing, literally the exact opposite position of the one that Parmenides and Zeno had. For example, Heraclitus held that there is no such thing as the self that persists through time, but only a jumble of atoms constantly in flux that give the impression of permanence. This position in turn is known as dynamic monism, as opposed to the static monism mentioned earlier. So the static monism is associated with Parmenides, who argued that change is impossible, who argued that that change was impossible since it would involve something coming from nothing. And dynamic monism refers to Heraclitus's view that there is no such thing as being or permanence. Rather, all there is change. Now, both of these conclusions seem absurd, and they are, but it wasn't until Aristotle introduced the concepts of actuality, or simply act, and potency that these arguments were debunked. Act refers to the existence of a thing, while potential refers to a middle ground between pure act and nothingness that is really existence in the thing. Quoting Ed Feser from his Aristotle's Revenge, the water that makes up an ice cube is actually cold, but it is potentially liquid and potentially lukewarm. When the sun melts the ice cube into a puddle, these potentials are actualized. What change in general involves, then, is precisely that sort of thing, vis-a-vis the actualization of potential. End quote. It is important to hammer home this point that potency is a really existent feature of the world when combined with act. Here's Ed Feser again on the reality of potency. Beginning quote. Given that a potential is something really in a thing, a change to the thing involves being of one sort. In the traditional jargon, being in potency, giving rise to being of another sort, being in act, rather than non-being or nothingness giving rise to being. Let me read that again, because I kind of take a swig here. That was bad delivery. Here's Ed Feser again on the reality of potency. Given that a potential is something really in a thing, a change to the thing involves being of one sort, in the traditional jargon, being in potency, giving rise to being of another sort, being in act, rather than non-being or sheer nothingness giving rise to being. To illustrate this point, imagine once again that you are a food critic about to judge a Taco Bell taco. Also, still not a sponsor. At the moment T1 you are salivating over this taco, it exists as a taco. But supposing you apply hot sauce to the taco at the moment T2, then the taco will become a taco with hot sauce. Parmenides would say that this is impossible since the taco going from a taco at T1 to a hot taco at T2 would involve change. Under the framework of act and potency, though, the taco has a real objective potency to receive hot sauce. Being is not only act, it also includes real potency. S at T1 is actually, I forgot to, this is actually a quote from the Disputed Questions blog that I forgot to say beforehand, so quoting disputed questions now, being is not only act, it also includes real potency. S at T1 is actually F1 and potentially F2. At T2, S is now actually F2 because its potential for F2 has been made actual. So F2 does not come from either actual being or nothing, it comes from potency or potential being. S at T1 has a real objective capacity for F2. End quote. Now, that's a really confusing quote, but I'm going to read it again, this time uh, inserting the taco as S and the hot sauce as the change that it undergoes. Okay, so once again, quoting disputed questions with our example from Taco Bell substituted in. Being is not only act, it also includes real potency. The taco at T1 is actually uh, not a hot taco and potentially a hot taco. At T2 or the second instant, um, taco is now actually hot taco because its potential for hot taco has been made actual. So hot taco does not come from either actual being or nothing, or the hotness that makes the taco hot does not come from either actual being or nothing. It comes from potency or potential being. Taco at T1 at the first instance has a real objective capacity for hot taco. However, let's consider. Oh, sorry. Sorry. We already went over that, so let me just find my place here. Um, okay, so like the good food critic you are, let's say that after applying hot sauce, you decide to throw this taco into the trash. This would actualize a different potential at T2, the potential for the taco to become garbage. Finally, if you were to take the hot taco out of the trash and eat it, that would actualize the garbage's potential at T3 to be eaten. The potential for a taco to become a hot taco, potential for a hot taco to become garbage, and potential for garbage to be eaten are all real separate objective potentialities of things that have been actualized in this case. And remember that potentialities just means a capacity inherent in the thing for something else. And that actualization means bringing that potency into being. Um, okay, so contra Parmenides, therefore, Aristotelianism agrees that it is impossible for something to come from nothing, but argues that that is not what change is. Rather, change is the result of actualization of potentials, really existent in the world as noted above. Returning to the dichotomy paradox, remember the first paradox from Zeno, we can now say that the distances to be traversed in between A and B are there only potentially, while the only actual distance is the one being traveled over. Um, this response also applies to change in general, since the paradox applies to all distances. Give me a second, I just gotta take a swig. Oof, sorry. So now, in response to Heraclitus, who again believed that there were no permanent aspects to things only becoming or only change, we can now say that the capacity for change found in potency must be grounded in something already actual. Potency without any real act can't exist since it wouldn't have anything actual to adhere to, and even if potency existed without act, there wouldn't be any actuality there to bring it into being. Parmenides and Heraclitus also had radical views on multiplicity, or complexity would be a rough approximation there. Parmenides argued that the only way to distinguish one thing from another is non-being, which is just nothing. Therefore, he argued, there are no distinct things in reality, only being unmixed. Parmenides had another assist from Zeno this time, who provided a conundrum known as the paradox of parts. Zeno argues that if there were distinct things in the universe, each of those things would have size. But since something is larger the more parts it has, distinct things must have infinite size and are the same size as each other, which is absurd. Therefore, there are no distinct things in the universe, just being. Yeah, pretty epic conclusion. hot take here. Heraclitus, in turn, argues that since nothing actual exists, there can't be unity in the universe since the universe is in a state of constant flux. This denial of abiding objects implies that there is no thing in the universe at all, but just a mass of becoming or changing. With regards to multiplicity, then, Heraclitus argues that there are radically more things or almost things. In response to Parmenides, we can respond by saying that his presupposition that being is the only way to distinguish between things is false. Once again, because he didn't take potency into account. He only had existence and non-existence. Whereas with our introduction of potency, we have act, potency, which is a real capacity for existence, and then nothing. Therefore, things can be distinguished by potency, which, as we saw earlier, is a type of being, and Parmenides' argument falls apart. Let's see how we're doing on time. Okay. In response to Zeno's paradox of parts, we can say once again that the multiplicity present in things is present there only potentially. Only when the division is actualized by something, such as a jackhammer on concrete, does the division actually exist. Finally, in response to Heraclitus, we can say that change is impossible in a world that is only potential, since potency requires being to actualize it. Whew! After all of this, then, we arrive at the Aristotelian definition of act and potency as a working theory of being, and are now ready to consider the first thesis of the 24 Thomistic theses. As background, the 24 Thomistic theses are a group of 24 tenets promulgated by the Sacred Congregation of Studies, part of the administration of the Pope, in 1914 that encompass the positions held by Thomism, so named after St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived in the 13th century, and is the church's best philosopher and theologian. Sorry, St. Augustine. Held by Thomism and distills them into 24 separate arguments. So there's 24 theses here that these people are saying, that the Sacred Congregation of Studies is saying you have to accept as true if you're going to be a Thomist. Without further ado, then, here is the first thesis. Potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. Again, from 24 Theses. As you can hear, we've already covered much of this thesis, and it's now time to put it all together. The thesis starts off by saying, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists, and then ... which is an argument that potency and act completely determine the being there is, i.e., everything is some combination of potency and act. But what combination exactly? Let's look at the quote again. Whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act. We have already encountered pure act, which is simply being without any potency, and the composition of potency and act simply means that a thing is not pure act, and so that it is not pure act and therefore must have potencies to determine its being. This is what is meant by as to its primordial and intrinsic principles in the original quote. What this means further illustrate what this means, in the case of actuality mixed with potency, the actuality and the potentiality are inherent features of the thing. That is to say, an acorn has a real potency to grow into a tree, but not a real potency to grow into a giraffe. There is something inherent in the acorn that makes it grow into a tree rather than a giraffe. So pure act has been explained as well as the composition of potency in act, but why isn't there a corresponding division for pure potency? As we saw earlier, and I've been making this point throughout this podcast, in response to Heraclitus, potency can't exist without something actual bringing it into being. And since pure potency presupposes a world without actuality, there is nothing to separate pure potency from non-being. So pure potency is strictly impossible from a practical point of view, but is useful as a way of thinking about the difference between potency and act. Um, all right, so let's give a brief overview. Let's give a brief uh, examination of what we just looked at. Uh, give me a second here. Okay, so there was a lot in that episode. It was really packed in, and hopefully this will distill it down into some more palatable chunks. Metaphysics is the study of the supersensible, or alternatively, the study of being qua being. Remember that qua just means as. In contradistinction to both the Eleatics, who are Parmenides and Zeno, and Heraclitus, Aristotle posited two principles which constitute being: act and potency. Act refers to the existence of a thing, while potential refers to a middle ground between pure act and nothingness that is nonetheless really existent in the thing. These two principles refute the Eleatic's defense of static monism, which is essentially act with no potency, and Heraclitus's defense of dynamic monism, which can be described as potency with no act, if such a thing were possible. Instead, Aristotle's system of potency and act allow for change where change is understood as the actualization of a potential, avoiding both the pitfalls of static and dynamic monism. Finally, this section rounds off with a definition of the first Thomistic principle, that is, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists either is a pure act or is necessarily composed of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. All right, I think that pretty much concludes the philosophy section, so let's now turn over to the politics side. All right, so give me a second here. All right, so one down, two more to go. This takes us now to the political portion of the podcast, where we will examine Plato's Republic. Yeah, I'm not sure how long I'm going to be studying Plato's Republic, but we'll see how far I can get today, and then, uh, maybe I'll announce it before the next episode how far I'm going to be going. Um, so this first politics podcast will look at um, the first book to midway through the second book when Socrates starts speaking again. Um, okay. And again, this is Plato's Republic we're studying. Um, First, let's start with a little bit of a history lesson. We already mentioned Parmenides, his student Zeno, Heraclitus, and Aristotle in the philosophy portion of this podcast, and it is now time to introduce two more to our cast of characters, Socrates and his student Plato. Let's put everything in context here by examining their relative position in history. Historians divide philosophers in ancient Greece into two categories: pre-Socratics, meaning before Socrates, and the Socratics. Of these six, Parmenides, Zeno, and Heraclitus are all pre-Socratics, while Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are all Socratics. Parmenides, Zeno, and Heraclitus were all born in the 6th century BC, or right after it, while Socrates himself was born in 470 BC and lived to 399 BC. From there, his student Plato lived from circa 425 BC to 347 BC, and Plato's student Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC. So we can see that the Socratics came after the pre-Socratics, and were no doubt influenced by their work. And it's also interesting to note that Plato is the link between Socrates and Aristotle, and there's a really nice chain of thinking that goes in with that. Okay, so yeah, as I just mentioned, Plato was a student of Socrates, which is important because Plato's Republic is written in the form of a dialogue between Socrates and some young men. It's a sort of question and answer back and forth known as the Socratic method. And in the Republic, this method is used both as a way to refute untrue ideas, such as its use against Thraciamachus in the first chapter, or as a way to develop them, as when he asks leading questions to his students to develop his views. By leading questions, I don't mean like, you're in a court of law and you ask the question, when was the last time you beat your wife, where it's presupposed that that you did beat up your wife. But um, Sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought here. Um, yeah, so it's not like though that kind of leading question where it's presupposing an answer to another question. It's more like, he's asking questions that that are directly related to each other in the hope of leading the conversation somewhere productive. Although I will say I mean there are some like actually leading questions that he asks, but I would say for the most part, most of them are not leading questions in the legal sense. Um, all right. Oh, excuse me. Having introduced the history, it is now time to introduce the book itself. Plato's Republic is one of Plato's best known works and concerns the rightful ordering of society as well as that of the individual. This rightful ordering of society and of the individual is what Plato considers to be the virtue of justice. So, in effect, Plato's Republic is the search for justice and what it entails in both the society and the individual. Well, without further ado, let's right into chapter 1. Um, okay, here we go. Republic starts off with Socrates being accosted by a group of men at the end of the festival with the request that he come to their house. Socrates acquiesces and there talks to an old man who argues that it is the manner of one's living that determines whether old age is a burden rather than old age itself. This conversation naturally changes to virtue, with Socrates asking the old man what justice is. The old man says that justice is the giving of what is owed, but can't stay to maintain his argument further, so another man, Polemarchus, jumps in for him. After a lengthy back and forth between them, Polemarchus is forced to change his definition of justice to those actions which benefit friends who are good and harm enemies who are bad. This definition, however, is discarded when Socrates claims that it is not just to harm anyone, and giving everyone their due would require harming one's enemies. Before moving on, it is interesting to point out here that this ethic of not harming enemies, which was itself a major departure from the ethics of the time, was expanded on even further by Jesus Christ in Matthew 5:44, where he says, "Love your enemies, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them that persecute and calumniate you." Again, Matthew 5:44. In the main here, this is actually a rather amazing definition coming from someone living 350 plus years before Christ. The one thing that was a little unclear, however, at least to me, is whether Polemarchus's definition of justice was supposed to also apply to God and the state as well. If so, remember his definition of justice is giving good to friends and giving good to good friends and harming bad enemies. Um, okay. All right. So if he meant this argument to also extend to the state, this argument that I just mentioned, to the state and God, well, I'm not so sure that that holds water. Socrates takes down Polemarchus's definition by saying it is wrong to harm the bad, and which is a noble ethic for the individual, and I would totally agree with that on the individual level. But if applied to the state and God, there might be some iffy consequences from that. Basically, if God can't harm and here I know we're presupposing that God exists, but you can substitute the state in for this as well. If God or the state can't give evil men the penalties they deserve, um, then uh, then there would be no way to hold these evil men to account. And it would be true what was said in Isaiah 59:15 that truth has been forgotten, and he that departed from evil lay open to be a prey. And the Lord saw, and it appeared evil in his eyes because there was no judgment. Um, yeah, so justice in the Polemarchus' definition of justice is actually a great one for the individual, but not necessarily a good one for the state and God. Additionally, now this might seem like kind of a random side note, but um, this is really important because Plato sees the state and the individual as reflections of each other. There's a point where he says, like, if you're trying to see um, letters on a stone from far away and you can't see them, it's better to have a big stone with bigger letters and look at that one first, so you can get an idea of what the smaller one says. Um, so the smaller one being the individual, justice in the individual, and the bigger one being justice in the state. Um, well, this is a very interesting view. I don't know that it, yeah, and this idea that justice for the individual involves restraining from harming people, but justice on a state level or for God doesn't, would include harming people or giving them what they deserve. It's kind of incompatible. Um, and it also splits the justice for the individual from justice to the state, and kind of might compromise Plato's argument that starting with the state would give us light to understanding the individual. Um, okay. Let's see. Yeah. So if we apply this to the state, it would be absurd to suggest that the just state is one where evil men are allowed to do whatever they want without being harmed. But this is the conclusion of Socrates' argument at the level of the state. Um, yeah. So so there's either two things going on here. Socrates either didn't intend to have his refutation refer to the state or to God, in which case what is just must be different between the state and the individual, which would call into question Plato's later arguments about the individual and the state alike. Remember the small rock and the big rock with letters? Or he did intend to have this definition of justice refer to the state and God, in which case evil men would overrun the earth without penalty. This might seem like much ado about nothing, but the definition of justice is literally what the entire book is about, and it seems premature, to me at least, to discard this plausible definition in the cases of the state and God. Um, okay. Be that as it may, however, and returning to the topic at hand, a newcomer emerges named Thraciamachus, who claims that justice is the subjection of the weak to the strong, i.e., might makes right. Pretty much a Machiavellian kind of view. Locke also, the Leviathan, thinking about that. Life in a state of nature is nasty, short, nasty, brutish, and short. Wait, life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, or something like that. But yeah, so this definition kind of like inverts the whole thing and puts injustice as the virtue and justice as the vice. And this is what Socrates' questioning eventually leads to, is as Thrasymachus is trying to maintain this definition, it turns out that he's forced to admit that justice for the individual, crap. Yeah, he's forced to admit that injustice is the virtue and justice the vice. Um, and he makes this argument from like what people believe, or what people say, or about the state, in terms of like honor and stuff like that. He argues that people want to lead, be in the state. They want to have power, and the having of power allows them to dominate everyone else. And it is only the state which forces people to do the right thing that keeps that from happening. Um, so uh, let me see here. Yeah. But Socrates argues after this that um, let's see. I'm trying to remember here. Um, if Thrasymachus is true, if it's true what Thrasymachus is saying, that the power is only to be sought for itself, this would contradict um, the what we understand about the different crafts and different uh, like academic disciplines or uh, um, like different or like actual crafts like um, like uh, tapestry making or like whatever it is out there, and shepherd being a shepherd. And so Socrates uses this example of the shepherd to show that he doesn't rule over the sheep to dominate them. He rules over the sheep to take care of them. That's what good husbandry means. Um, and in all other cases in the arts, we can see that the craft is is aiming for the good of the thing for which it is uh, uh, modifying. And then applying that also to the state, Socrates argues that the state, as sort of the shepherd of the people, is also concerned with the benefit of the people rather than the domination of that that Thrasymachus is suggesting would happen, and which is in line with more Machiavellian and Lockean. No, sorry, it wasn't Locke. Sorry, it was Hobbes. Wow, sorry, Hobbes' view of the state of nature, like without loss. Um, so Thrasymachus he retires after getting soundly beaten, but then in the beginning of book two, we think we're off the hook, like this argument is now dead. Polemarchus and his brother both um, take up this argument and really to really push it to the extreme in terms of what uh, what Thrasymachus could have argued. Um, so they say, all right, let's imagine that. Uh, actually, they point to a story about how someone found a ring, and after accidentally putting it on his finger, he realized that he was invisible to everyone else, and they put the question to Socrates, like he can do literally anything while he's invisible. Um, like he can have as much food as he wants. He can like have sex with whoever he wants. He can kill the king and go in power. Whatever he wants basically. And then Polemarchus and his brother, I think Admetus, say like what person would refrain from doing those things if given the opportunity. Um, and then they also go on to pose to Socrates another dilemma of the just man versus the unjust man. So they argue, okay, unjust man. Let's have an unjust man who gets everything that on earth that you could want: power, money, fame, whatever, uh, and through unjust means. And his unjustness is not injustice is never figured out. So he also gets the benefits of honor and good opinion from um, his people. And then let's contrast that with the just man who has everything taken away from him and has to live like out in the streets or whatever, uh, because he doesn't want to use those same means. Polemarchus and Admetus argue, what man would choose the just man over the unjust in that case, or uh, like um, yeah. So what man would choose the just over the unjust in that case, and how can you call the just man happy in that case? Um, and they pose to Socrates this question, and then they kind of let it be. They make it very clear they don't actually believe it, but they need an explanation for it. Um, because they weren't satisfied because Thrasymachus' objections didn't carry the argument far enough. Um, all right, that is about all midway through the second book. So Thrasymachus, or sorry, no, Polemarchus and his brother stop um, stop talking, and then the next week we'll be looking at uh, Socrates' response to them, and in the second half of the second book, and probably further on as well, through perhaps the third and fourth books. Um, yeah, I think that's all for politics. So yeah, thank you, and we'll uh, we'll turn it over to the economics section of the podcast. All right, give me a second here. Oof. Okay. All right. We now finally turn to the economic part of this podcast, which will give a brief introduction to economics and then examine the present day division between positive and normative economics. In this podcast, I will argue that this division between positive and normative economics intrudes upon other academic disciplines which should be studying the subject material instead. Okay, what does that mean? We'll get into it, don't worry. Simply put, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. Burn that into your brain. Simply put, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources. What does this mean? First of all, allocation simply means the distribution or handing out of things. So economics is the study of handing out of scarce things. But why scarce? If there was an infinite amount of resources being handed out, like an infinite amount of lemonade stands, a free lemonade stand that could hand out an infinite number of drinks, then that lemonade could supply anyone who wanted one, and there wouldn't be any way to study. There wouldn't be anything else to study there. So when supplied resources are scarce, however, that lemonade stand only has enough materials to make a certain amount of lemonade. There may be multiple ways to allocate them. Like the person within the lemonade stand could add more sugar, could have less sugar, more lemons, stuff like that. Um, if that is the case, then a decision must be made whether to supply resources here or there, and it is that decision that economics studies. Um, an example of a scenario where resources are scarce would be something like this. Suppose there are two men living on a desert island with one coconut, and let's assume for the sake of argument that it can't be shared. How will it be allocated? There are only three options. Either both men restrain from eating it, or one person might get it, or the other person might get it. This is what positive economics, the supposedly objective branch of economics, can tell us. However, positive economics can't go much beyond that, i.e., it can't tell us what ought to happen, only what happens or is likely to happen. On the other hand, normative economics claims to fill in that gap by prescribing rules for what ought to happen. That is, it claims to answer the question of which of the three outcomes ought to be preferred. This division of positive and normative economics is maintained today, as I've experienced at the University of Michigan, but there are actually serious problems with this split. Yeah, so this goes back to the rather confusing thesis at the beginning, which is that economics has set itself up as the science of human decision making um, to force, like not allowing any other disciplines to jump in and have their say. Um, in the positive branch, decisions are, remember, positive meaning examining what happens or is likely to happen and not what ought to happen. Decisions are ostensibly analyzed with complete objectivity. That is, they study only that portion of human decision making which can be either quantified or measured without respect to moral or normative principles. Moral and normative here just mean ought or ought not. You ought to do this, ought not, you shouldn't do this. However, there are two problems with this claim concerning positive economics. The first is that although it is certainly true that if an agent acts in their rational self-interest, then what positive economics argues would happen will happen, but it is only true if the agent acts in their rational self-interest. There are two options for positive economics here. It could either bite the bullet and say that its methods and practices are only contingently true upon some other moral principle which it can't analyze, or claim that the fact that agents always act in their self-interest is trivially true, like it's an axiom they don't need to prove. With respect to the former claim, the one about the positive economics being limited to only saying what is contingently true upon some other normative principle, this would concede the point that positive economics needs a normative argument at its very root, which again it wouldn't be able to study. With respect to the latter claim, that the fact that rational self-agents agents always act in their self-interest is precisely what is at issue, and so it would be begging the question just to stipulate it as an obvious fact. Even if the claim that agents always act in their self-interest were true, however, positive economics would still not be able to answer the question of whether this is the way it ought to be. As if that weren't enough, there's a second problem with positive economics. Much of what positive economics argues about how people behave has been shown to be wrong by historical fact and modern psychology. For example, the idea that the free market will sort itself out in a way beneficial to everyone if everyone is just left alone, as Adam Smith claimed, is on extremely tenuous grounds. The historical record of the brutal industrial revolutions in different countries such as England, and all the moral problems that came with that, such as child labor, seriously suggests that free market capitalism leads to monopolies rather than free competition, and that the brutalities of that time period, such as child labor, are not an accidental byproduct of the free market, but rather follow from letting greedy people do what they want. More on that claim in future episodes, because that's a hot take. Finally, modern psychology shows that people behave in quote-unquote irrational ways that don't conform to the economicist view of things. Examples include things like anchoring, social norms, and much more. I gotta take a swig here. Okay. All right. So that was with positive economics. Now let's look at normative economics. The first problem with normative economics, again, normative meaning what ought to happen or, what ought to happen or what ought not to happen. The first problem with normative economics is that it has a seriously narrow and simply wrong view of the human being. The fact that agents always act in their rational self-interest is claimed to be the motive behind normative economics' takeover of the ethics of decision-making, but its definition of rational self-interest is an extremely materialistic and desiccated one. This wouldn't necessarily be an issue if economics restricted itself to the study of what is quantifiable, since what is quantifiable can only be found in measurable materialistic things. Instead, though, through its claim to know what ought to be done, normative economics is able to pass off all of its material presuppositions as trivially true when those presuppositions are precisely what is at issue. Remember what I said before about positive economics depending upon a normative principle, and that you can't assume that normative principle to be true, because that would simply be begging the question. What exactly are these materialistic, desiccated presuppositions then? We have already seen how dependent economics is on this idea of rational self-interest. The question of what counts as self-interest, however, is not a claim that economics is equipped to answer. The claim that people ought to act in their rational self-interest is a philosophical and not an economic claim, and must be defended using the means of philosophical inquiry. Does rational self-interest mean that people in fact act to make themselves happy? If so, then that means rational self-interest is assumed to be what makes people happy, which is an extremely absurd thing to posit as self-evident given the amount of controversy in philosophy over precisely this question. Does happiness come from virtue, a la Aristotle, or hedonism, a la Epicurus? What about the stoicism of Epictetus? The list of differing answers to what makes people happy is absolutely ginormous. So we are left with a conundrum. The claim underlying all of present-day economics, which is that agents act out of purely materialistic self-interest, is a philosophical one belonging to the field of ethics and not one that can be analyzed through the lens of the not one that can be analyzed through the lens of normative economics. If this is true, then economics must cede normative economics to ethics, which is part of philosophy, which includes the claim underlying and also so normative economics must cede to ethics, but positive economics must also cede its normative presuppositions to ethics as well. Anything normative in economics should be reserved for philosophical analysis, since economics studies things only from a quantifiable point of view. Um, in this way, economics on its own would be restricted to positive economics without the normative principles, i.e., the study of what actually happens or is likely to happen, and it would only examine normative claims such as, the claim that rational agents act in their self-interest. It would only examine such claims contingently upon them being true. Like it can't say they are true. It just has to assume the fact that they are true, and then study what would happen if it was carried out to its full capacity. Oof. Okay, let's recap. Oh, excuse me. In the present day, economics is divided into positive and normative branches. The positive one studying what is or what may be, and the normative studying what ought to be. Oh, excuse me again, sorry. Oof. This division, however, is riddled with problems. Positive economics can't claim to be free of norms, since the claim underlying its analysis, that agents act in their rational self-interest, is a normative one and therefore at best can only study what is contingently true upon this claim. Secondly, modern psychology and a Catholic view of the human being both contradict positive economics' desiccated and materialistic view of the human being. Finally, the claims that normative economics claims to study through the lens of rational self-interest can't be justified through purely economic means, and so should rightfully be a part of philosophy rather than economics. In this way, positive economics must scrap its view of the human being and see the notion that agents always act in their self-interest to normative economics, and normative economics in turn must cede that argument and all itself to a philosophical mode of analysis rather than an economic one. And I would also argue that their positive economics in studying what does or what actually happens must also cede ground, must work together with psychology and a not and a proper view of the human being as, body and soul, directed for the purpose of enjoying God in heaven. And obviously that's asking that to be merged with economics and psychology. It would be a little hard to synthesize all of those, but if you really wanted to study decision making, that's what that kind of division, that kind of unity is what needs to happen, that kind of talk between disciplines. So economics, again, like just sticks to numbers and can only study what happens. But psychology is a little more accurate when it comes to studying economic behavior, and shows that there are numerous things that we do that are irrational, that don't conform to Adam Smith's view of, everyone is just the most important, the most basic principle of human behavior is the principle to barter and tuck, to buy and sell, which is all itself on pretty tenuous ground. So, yeah, so I think that was about 15 minutes rather than 20 minutes, but that's about all I have. So I guess I'll say thank you all for making it this far, and please let me know what you think about this podcast. I'll try to put up a quiz or a sheet to where you can record what you thought, and yeah, I'll try to change it so that it's more interesting to you guys and more instructive. Um, All right, so I think that's about it. And so I'll say thank you all again for listening, and God bless. Thanks again.